years, I've seen an unprecedented attack on the left, alleging that its opposition to Israel is driven by anti-Semitism. This has become the prevailing orthodoxy, even though not a single professionally conducted survey to gauge the level of anti-Semitism suggests that there has been an increase of anti-Semitism on the left over the past decade, or that there is a significant level of anti-Semitism on the radical left. The most serious, in-depth study remains that published in 2014 by the Institute of Jewish Policy Research. The author is Daniel Statsky, called Anti-Semitism in Contemporary Great Britain, which concluded, I quote, "The very left wing are on the whole no more anti-Semitic than the general population, but neither are they less anti-Semitic." And the figure for that general population that the survey gives is around 5%. The most intense and highest level of anti-Semitism is, as you would expect, on the far right, and in line with almost every other survey, there is more anti-Semitism on the moderate to extreme right than on the moderate to extreme left. Surveys also consistently show that the level of anti-Semitism is much higher among conservative than among Labour supporters. Why then this obsession with left-wing anti-Semitism? The main explanation from the left has been that this has been a campaign generated by an alliance between Labour's right, the pro-Israeli lobby, and the liberal and right-wing media, who saw in the charge of anti-Semitism against the left an effective weapon to discredit Jeremy Corbyn and a more radical turn by Labour, and thereby preempt the development of this more radical agenda in both domestic and foreign policy. There are solid reasons for this explanation, but it gives only part of the picture. Yes, different groups opportunistically, even cynically, jumped on the bandwagon to claim that the left's opposition to Israel is driven by anti-Semitism. But that does not explain by itself why that claim gained such momentum, why it appears to have convinced people even with no vested interest. The fact that so many liberal-minded people willingly went along with this narrative without questioning its evidential basis, which, as I suggested, is flimsy to the extreme, suggests that there was something else at work here. In fact, attributing anti-Semitism to critics of Israel could use the flimsiest of evidence because it appeared to many people credible, even self-evident. Alleging anti-Semitism against the left for its opposition to Israel became for many liberal commentators a form of virtue signaling, a way to demonstrate their own anti-racism. This poses the question, how attitude to Israel has become the litmus test for what is and what is not anti-Semitism, and more generally, what is and what is not anti-racism. Now, the argument I want to put to you, and this is my paper today, is that the dominant view of how Israel should be perceived, and therefore the condemnation of the left's attitude to it, have been much longer in the making than the Corbyn years, and that it is linked to an offensive on a much wider front than merely defeating Corbynism. It is, in fact, bound up with the politics of race, first promoted by New Labour and followed by successive governments as part of what they saw as a culture war, or they didn't call it that, they called it a war of values against militant Islam. Now, the reason that some political messages resonate is that they're able to harness already existing ideas and interests. They fit in with ideas propagated by the political and cultural elites and are therefore widely shared. There always exists political agencies to promote certain causes, but to be able to convince, they also have to mobilize and build on pre-existing ideas and sentiments. The effect of some well-established ideas on popular perception of the Israeli-Palestine issue almost everywhere in Western Europe is illustrated by Joris Luyendyk. He's a Dutch journalist who was posted in the Middle East in the early 2000s, soon after he left university. And he reported both from Israel and the West Bank. And he subsequently wrote an interesting account of experience in a book called People Like Us, which is on the subject of Western perceptions of the Arab world. And he shows how reporting from the Middle East is difficult, apart from anything else, because whatever journalists with the best will in the world write from there, editors tend to select that which fits in with the cliches and prejudices that the editors anticipate European audiences want to hear. In any case, he recalls a discussion he had with colleagues in the Netherlands, and I quote, "If I ever wanted to defend Israel during such conversations, one phrase was sufficient: the Holocaust. Most people understood immediately. Then I tried to put the Palestinian perspective across, and 10 sentences were never enough. Central to them was not the Holocaust, but centuries-long Western interference in their area. The handicap for the Palestinians is that the Crusaders and colonization are less prominent in the Western consciousness." So this links to what I'm saying is that the preconditions for certain ideas are much more favorable than to others. In the case of the United States, and Amy Kaplan, a cultural historian, provides a historical account of how supporters of Israel have over time changed the narrative around Israel's public perceptions, around public perceptions of US public perceptions of Israel, to make the Zionist project appealing to the US public, or at least to a significant section of it. Adapting the message is, of course, how all political groups work to win public support. The terms in which they present their case have to take into account what the people they address think. Kaplan's book is called America's Israel, and I've called this talk Britain's Israel, to acknowledge trying to do something similar to what Kaplan has done, to look at how we might view the shaping of British attitudes to Israel and Zionism that pre-existed and to some extent run concurrently with the onslaught on the left over Israel and anti-Semitism. Briefly, to give you an idea of Kaplan's approach, she shows you that the political basis on which Israel's appeal for American public support has been pitched was quite fluid, reflecting changes in the ideals cherished in US political culture. Thus, prior to World War II, the Zionist movement presented itself to the US public and was supported largely on that basis, much like on the basis that, like the settler movement in North America that the Pilgrim Fathers launched, the Zionists too represented a heroic quest to tame the Wild West and bring modernity to a backward part of the world. Building Israel was presented like the westward expansion that drove out and killed the indigenous people, but of course that dimension of it was not emphasized. It was the heroism of bringing the wilds under control. After World War II, the angle changed. Sympathy was elicited for the setting up of the Jewish state as an anti-colonial struggle. Britain was depicted as the imperial power that was behaving as it had in the time of George III, but instead of trying to thwart American independence, it was now trying to prevent an independent Jewish state from emerging. And it was doing that in order to appease, so it was presented, backward feudal rulers in the surrounding territories. In the immediate post-war years, you have to remember the US still saw itself as an anti-colonial power And it's true, of course, that for its own expansion, it did want the dismantling of the British and French empires, but of course not from an anti-imperialist perspective, but to build its own spheres of influence. By the late to mid 1950s, but then particularly after the 1967 war, Israel shed its anti-colonial image and was viewed through the prism of the Cold War. And therefore its victories in the 1967 and 1973 wars were interpreted for the American public as triumphs against a Soviet-supported Arab enemy. By the 1970s, argues Kaplan, there was even a tendency to depict Israel as being able to fight wars in a way that the US, bogged down in Vietnam and weakened by domestic anti-war opposition, seemed unable to do anymore. For many, particularly on the right, Israel was doing what they thought the US should be doing, but had gone soft, and had gone soft because of the domestic liberals and leftists. However, Israel's war in Lebanon from 1979, which led to the 1982 Sabra and Shatila massacres, tarnished considerably this warrior nation image. And by the 1980s, another narrative moved in its place largely, and it was promoted to rescue support for Israel because of this tarnished image. The portrayal shifted to the plucky frontline state defending Western interests in the face of rising Islamic movements. So far, that's Kaplan's perspective in relation to the American public. And I would just say by way of criticism that she's a cultural historian, and there tends to be a kind of determinism about her account. There is no political agency to mold the opinions of public, but nonetheless, it's a very useful book indeed. Now, when we turn to how Israel has gained public support in the UK, there are some similarities with what Kaplan describes for the US. On the political elite level, from the late 1960s onwards, Israel is seen as an important strategic ally, but for the purposes of understanding how Israel was perceived by the wider public in this country, it is at least as important, alongside the strategic elite concern, to see how liberal opinion makers responded. Now, in the UK before World War II, the Zionist project had a popular appeal among liberals and the left. And in fact, and particularly the left, were its main public advocates, its main protagonists, on the ground that it was a modernizing force. For the Labour Party, Labour Zionism was particularly attractive, building a socialist nation, as it was claimed, through the kibbutzim and the Histadrut, the Federation of Labour, the trade union federation, seemed to provide an alternative to the Bolshevik model. It was gradualist, peaceful, it did not threaten to overthrow the state like the Bolsheviks did, and above all, expressed itself content with staying within the British Empire. And of course, the Labour Party was, after the war, for clinging on to the empire. For most of the mandate period, the Zionists wanted to remain under imperial rule, of course, because they depended on British imperial protection to carry on its colonization. It's also a fact that the kibbutzim and the Histadrut, which were so much praised and seen as models for social democracy, were of course exclusively for Jews. They excluded Arabs, hardly the model for working class solidarity. But nonetheless, it was supported widely by the labor movement, and particularly on its left wing. It was only, in terms of the tension with British Empire, it was only in the late 1930s, in the face of the German threat, that the British, to placate Arab leaders, sought to restrict Jewish immigration into Mandate Palestine. And that was a contradiction that emerged, as often does between settlers and imperial power. That was the contradiction between the Zionists and the British that led to their armed conflict after the war, and to Britain quitting Palestine in May 1948. Now, I will not go further into the shifting ideological support for Israel in Britain after 1948. I want to fast forward to the 1980s, by which time Israel could not be marketed as a social democratic paradise in the midst of Arab autocracies. And of course, nor could it be marketed as force fighting imperialism. Like most Western capitalist economy, Israel underwent the neoliberal reforms that are associated with Thatcher, Kohl, and Reagan. So the state sector was dismantled, which undermined labor Zionism fatally. And there's been a steady decline in labor Zionism, notwithstanding the fact that in this country, the so-called Jewish labor movement claims affiliation to this political entity, which has diminished to almost nothing. Now, in this period, in this neoliberal period, Israel was more commonly portrayed by supporters not as a neoliberal paradise, but as the only democracy in the Middle East. But that was not sufficient, even when accepted at face value, because most Western liberal democracies professed, indeed prided themselves as multi-ethnic states. How could Israel be credited with being part of the West's value system, given that? Western states profess to uphold equality in these multi-ethnic and multicultural societies, and yet they declared support for Israel. I mean, they professed to champion multiculturalism and the multi-ethnic societies. And here was a state which was based on ethnocracy, on privileging one ethnic group, its Jewish citizens, against Palestinians. Accepting this contradiction as unproblematic rests on Israeli exceptionalism. Blair's speech at the 2001 Labour Party conference, which provided for him a grand tour of, to give a grand tour of the state of the world and what Anglo-Saxon, European and American development model and culture could bring to the world, show the extent to which this exceptionalism had come to be taken for granted in British political discourse. Now, this is what Blair says, and I can try and stick it up into the chat box. Let's see if I can manage that. Right, I hope that succeeded. I'm not sure that succeeded. Anyway, this is what Blair said at that 2001 Labour Party conference. The state of Israel must be given recognition by all, freed from terror, know that it is accepted as part of the future of the Middle East, not its very existence under threat. The Palestinians must have justice, the chance to prosper, and in their own land as equal partners with Israel in that future. We know that it is the only way, just as we know in our own peace process in Northern Ireland, there will be no unification of Ireland except by consent. And there will be no return to the days of unionist or Protestant supremacy, because those days have no place in the modern world. So the unionists must accept justice and equality for nationalists. End of quote. I've not cut anything from this. The Palestine issue runs into the Irish one seamlessly. Blair readily assumes, therefore, that while the days of Protestant supremacy has no place in the world, a state of Jewish supremacy demands acceptance, not least from its victims. We can't know if some of the audience found this juxtaposition incongruous, but certainly no newspaper reports on the speech show anything odd about it. In a certain sense, there has always been people claiming exceptionalism for the Zionist project. Pre-World War II, Labour Zionism claimed that the Zionist settlement expansion was not colonization, even though in pre-war times, Labour Zionism itself called it colonization, but it was a different form of colonization because it was benign. It didn't want to exploit the indigenous labor, but of course it didn't, because it wanted to remove them, to replace them with Jewish settlers. I mentioned already the post-war claim for Israel's uniqueness, that it was a model in the Middle East, first as social democracy and then as the only democracy. And of course, the only democracy claim, justification, can still be heard. But after more than 50 years of Israel's brutal occupation and countless investigations for war crimes and violations of humanitarian laws, this argument has much less force, not just for the left, but for liberals too. By the 1990s, Israel's exceptionalism, its grounds for calling for special dispensation, has however moved on to a new ideological ground in the UK. And this is implicit in Blair, but it is to what I want to turn to now in the remaining time I have. The perceived threat of Islam brought about what is widely described in the sociological literature as the retreat of multiculturalism. Now, this retreat consisted of the state redefining its understanding of multiculturalism to emphasize community cohesion in place of cultural diversity. Now, note that the officially sanctioned multiculturalism placed emphasis on defending cultural diversity, not on the need to counter the structure of racism. And that was always the case, but not simply, it's one thing to accept that we're in a multicultural society, it's another thing to make it into a policy. The policy of multiculturalism was always shifted the emphasis to celebrating diversity and distinct identities rather than confronting racism, rather than being anti-racist explicitly. Now, notwithstanding that, there is this shift, apparent retreat from multiculturalism as had been understood as a celebration of diversity. One of the political initiatives in this redefining of multiculturalism, and I'll indicate it in a little bit more detail later on, one of the political initiatives in this redefining of multiculturalism was the instrumentalization of Holocaust memorialization, and more generally, the representation of one particular form of racism, namely anti-Semitism, representing it as uniquely dangerous and demonstrating opposition to it assumed a special status of it being emblematic of the defense of Western liberal values. So having elevated anti-Semitism as particularly important form of racism, as uniquely dangerous, opposition to it then assumes a special status and one that is emblematic of the defense of Western liberal values. This was an anti-racism for which the British political elite and the pro-Israeli lobby found common cause, enabling each to fortify its own nationalist narrative as well as to validate their shared commitment to the Western neoliberal world order. Now, to unpack this a bit more before coming to the consequences of how these developments impacted on the politics of race, I want first to briefly point to some of the measures from the late 1990s aimed at reshaping multiculturalism, but also anti-racism. Secondly, to indicate how the state-supported interpretation of the Holocaust and of anti-Semitism was instrumentalized to promote an anti-racism, or more accurately, an interpretation of anti-racism that, rather than contesting, was aligned with the defense of the existing order. First then, multiculturalism and New Labour's efforts to redefine it. Now, the liberal understanding of multiculturalism is usually referenced to Roy Jenkins when, as Home Secretary in 1966, he declared that by integration, he and the Labour government of the time had in mind not the melting pot model, a reference obviously to the United States, or what Jenkins called a flattening process of assimilation, to turn, as he added, everyone into a stereotype Englishman, but he said as a society with equal opportunity accompanied by cultural diversity. So this was the official version. Now, there were effective critiques of this position, most notably by Stephen Unden and the Institute of Race Relations from the 1970s onwards, who pointed how multiculturalism detached racism from the structure of the capitalist economy and the capitalist state to make it into an issue around individual prejudice and cultural identities. No prizes for guessing which path was taken by New Labour. A celebrated formulation of New Labour's understanding of multiculturalism was given by Robin Cook, one of the architects of New Labour, who became Foreign Secretary when Blair came to power in 1997. In an April 2001 speech, he argued that British values, such as tolerance, had made Britain into a successful multi-ethnic society. And to demonstrate the point, he went on to say the following: chicken tikka masala is now a true British national dish, not only because it is the most popular, but because it is a perfect illustration of the way Britain absorbs and adapts external influences. Chicken tikka is an Indian dish. The masala sauce was added to satisfy the desire of the British people to have their meat served in gravy. End of quote. A picture then of perfect harmony based, of course, on British tolerance. A less quoted element of the speech is where he says the following: our cultural diversity is one of the reasons why Britain continues to be the preferred location for multinational companies setting up in Europe. This, end of quote, this consumer-friendly version of multiculturalism, suitable for cozying up to global capitalism, fitted with a third-way politics advocated by Clinton and Blair, which claimed to embrace values instead of doctrine. And of course, these Western values by 2001 was emphasized by New Labour in terms of shifting from the tolerance of diversity to more muscular virtues, prompted by concerns over Muslim communities' integration into British society. There were such concerns expressed prominently in the wake of the anti-Salman Rushdie demonstrations, over the satanic verses in 1989. But these concerns became more intense and moved to the political forefront with the summer 2001 riots in Oldham, Burnley, and Bradford, and still more later that year in the wake of 9/11. In the government's rhetoric, the emphasis was on the need for community cohesion now, shared values, celebrating British identity, etc. These were accompanied by measures such as the Anti-Terrorism, Crime and Security Act of 2001 and 2006, and the Immigration and Asylum and Nationality Acts of 2002 and 2006, which all reinforced the view that Britain was in a fight to salvage its way of life. Now, several academics have argued that this emphasis on the need for common values was only a rhetorical retreat from multiculturalism, from the celebration of diversity, that in practical terms little changed in terms of how government agencies dealt with the immigrant community. It continued as before. But even if this were the case, the rhetoric itself formed part of how New Labour sought to exert influence over the public's understanding of racism. The significant change came not in the form of trying to rein in ethnic diversity, but to redefine racism as emanating not from the British political system or capitalist system, the political order and the imperial system, but an alien external force that threatened Western values. I now want to turn to how this pro-imperial version of anti-racism in defense of what was defined as our values, such as our values being tolerance, parliamentary democracy, freedom of speech, although these are often kept fairly vague, not just how these were constructed by New Labour, but internationally by the neoliberal elite. Since the rise of political Islam in the 1980s, Israel has laid claim to the role of a frontline state in the struggle against militant Islam. So the domestic rhetoric was echoed abroad as well. Here is Netanyahu speaking in 2015, I quote, "Radical Islam does not hate the West because of Israel. It hates Israel because it is an organic part of the West. It rightly views Israel as an island of Western democracy and tolerance in an ocean of fanaticism and violence that it wishes to impose on the Middle East, Europe, and the entire world." End of quote. And much the same can be found in Blair's argument, as in his 2006 Los Angeles speech to the World Affairs Council, where after referencing Hezbollah and Hamas as part of the arc of Islamic extremism, and the consequent threat faced by Israel, without, of course, any mention of what grievances brought these Islamic movements into existence, Blair goes on to say, even the issue of Israel is just part of the same wider struggle for the soul of the region. It is a global fight about global values. It is about modernization. It is about whether our value system can be shown to be sufficiently robust. End of quote. The West's and Israel's role in the Middle East is magicked away into a battle between enlightenment and what Blair's one-time Europe Minister, Dennis McShane, characterized as endarkment, that being, of course, Islam. It is for this culture war, for popularizing the ideological battle lines as between the West, Israel included, and anti-Western Islamic forces that led to the weaponization of the Holocaust and anti-Semitism that I previously referred to. In January 2001, in The Guardian, the writer and journalist Anna Karf wrote of Holocaust commemoration in Britain in a dizzyingly short period of a 50-year near silence. Sorry, in a dizzyingly short period, a 50-year near silence has turned into an omnipresent obsession. End of quote. In fact, after 9/11, so after September 2001, the emphasis on Holocaust remembrance, or if you like, Holocaust memorialization, increased still further, and listed as it was for the task of giving greater emphasis to Western and specifically British values. The Holocaust has become such a central reference point in our moral universe that it is easy to forget the near silence, in Karp's words, which preceded it, which preceded the omnipresent obsession, to use again Karp's words. This is a topic that has been quite thoroughly discussed in recent times, and I just touch on it briefly. There were three main reasons suggested for the earlier silence, as opposed to the centrality that it occupies today in public attention, public awareness. Firstly, the extermination of Jews was known in the West from the winter of 1942, but the Western powers barely gave public acknowledgement to it, because with anti-Semitism rife in both Britain and the US, governments feared giving rise to the impression that the war was being fought for the Jews. That this impression would gain currency remained a concern even after the war. So the Holocaust, the murder of the Jews by the Nazis, was underemphasized both during the war and immediately after the war. But there were two further reasons why the murder of the Jews was given little, wasn't focused so much on at that time. The extermination comes from mainly in the East, in Poland and the eastern side of Germany, which were liberated by Soviet forces, so that the most horrific scenes, as at Auschwitz, did not have initially much exposure from the Western media, which in the spring of 1945 accompanied the British, mainly the British and US-led troops. Thirdly, and this is perhaps the most important factor, after the war, with the onset of the Cold War, Western propaganda was directed at showing that the Soviet and the Nazi system were much the same. They were both totalitarian. Therefore, the racism of Nazism, and specifically its extermination of European Jewry, did not fit this argument and was deliberately underplayed. In theories of totalitarianism, it was an all-powerful state crushing civil society and regimenting the individual that was the central focus, not obviously racism didn't fit into that. Before indicating just some of the steps taken to enhance the public prominence of the Holocaust subsequently, I want to make it absolutely clear from what perspective I'm coming to it. The Holocaust should be taught, and there should be public awareness of it. It has important lessons for our time. It was a modern state, in many ways not that different from contemporary authoritarian states that tried to eliminate an entire ethnic group at the heart of Europe with the use of industrial technology. There is no doubt that many people involved in the war, particularly Jewish survivors and army veterans, wanted the Holocaust to have a more prominent recognition in public life in order to educate people about the dangers of racism and fascism. But the way that the Holocaust and the Nazi period have come to be popularized for commemorative and educative purposes have been shaped by the political agenda of the British state and by pro-Israel groups. Now, first, I will present you some of the measures by which the Holocaust commemoration and education has intensified, mostly at the behest of the British government, at least in this country. The intensity of the scale is revealing of the emphasis according to it by relation to the historical events that highlight racism, such as, for example, slavery and colonialism, which are given much less exposure and which would pose questions not only about Germany's imperial record, but also Britain's and the US's. But there's also the more important issue of how this intensified commemoration and teaching of the Holocaust is framed. In other words, how it is interpreted for public consumption and what lessons about racism, nationalism, imperialism, etc. it points to or makes possible. So, although I will indicate what Karp refers to as omnipotent obsession, I think more important the degree of emphasis on memorializing the Holocaust and Nazi period as a whole. More important is how they have been interpreted to serve political objectives. So the issue is not so much the relative attention devoted to them by relation to other crimes of imperialism, but the political framing of them. the political framing of the Holocaust and anti-Semitism. But first, some indication of the steps by which the Holocaust commemoration and education was intensified. And these began mainly with New Labour when it came to power in 1997. In 1998, under the Blair government, a task force charged with curriculum review of the school history syllabus, reportedly under David Blunkett's explicit instruction, made the Holocaust the only compulsory topic in the history syllabus, Key Stage 3, that is for 11 to 13-year-olds. It had been part one of four from 1991, but it then became the only one. In 1999, Blair announced plans for Holocaust Memorial Day to be held each year on the 27th of January, the day Auschwitz was liberated. In January of this year, 2020, according to Holocaust Memorial Day Trust, 17,000 commemorative activities and events took place across the UK. I emphasize a government-initiated Holocaust memorialization, but of course Hollywood and other cultural institutions played an important part too. For example, Steven Spielberg's film Schindler's List, which is really about Christian heroism, ends with the concentration camp survivors gathering around Schindler's grave in Israel. So it ends with the Zionist message that the Holocaust is redeemed by the existence of Israel. Schindler's film was distributed free of charge to every single history department in the UK by the Holocaust Memorial Trust. Holocaust Memorial Day also references the genocides of Cambodia, Bosnia, Rwanda, and Darfur, but these are peripheral in the ceremonies and in the accompanying political discourse. The 1915 Armenian genocide does not even get this token mention. In 2000, the Imperial War Museum in London opened a permanent Holocaust exhibition, and subsequently both Cameron in 2015 and May in 2019 committed their governments to building a Holocaust National Memorial and Learning Centre next to the Houses of Parliament. Now, by contrast, there's not a single museum in the UK dedicated to the history of the British Empire. In the past few months, in response to the mobilisation by the Black Lives Matter movement, some acknowledgement has crept in about Britain's imperial past. But note how even then, there's an attempt to contain the acknowledgement of the evils of British imperialism to the evils of slavery, which of course can present Britain in a redemptive role for ending the trade in 1834. But of course, imperialism through colonial rule underwent expansion after that period. A common response to any comparisons, as I have alluded to, is to say that this risks setting up a competition in victimhood and is divisive, suggesting that sympathy for one ethnic group detracts from another. I mean, this competition seems to suggest that. I agree that there is this risk. The value of any such comparison is strictly limited to asking why some forms of racism and its victims count for less. But this does not require less to be said about the Holocaust. The equalization should not be less about the Holocaust and the Nazi crime. It should be more about other imperial crimes. And this requires that the Holocaust and the Nazi racism, what is said about them, should provide a framework for opening discussion about and heightening awareness about other forms of genocide and racism. I'm not speaking here of some hypothetical way that the Holocaust and the Nazi period could be looked at. I'm not speaking of some hypothetical approach to approach the Holocaust and the Nazi period. A wider, even I would claim, universalist perspective is already influential in academic history. It is, however, excluded from the mainstream representation of Nazism and the Holocaust in schools and in public commemorations, and it is for political reasons. By a universalist perspective, I mean one not tied to the self-serving assumptions of nationalist narratives, British and Israeli or US. Since the early 1990s, in academic studies of the Nazi period, there has been a decisive shift away from an internalist perspective, from the idea that Nazi racism and the extermination of Jews and of other groups can be explained purely by reference to forces internal to German society, there has been what is called a transnational turn, though this covers in fact two different, though not incompatible approaches. I'm conscious of the time. One connects Nazi racism and expansionism to the racism and the colonization of other imperial powers, indicated that they were mutually reinforcing. The Nazi imperial system existed in the context of other imperial powers, and they borrowed from each other various ideas and techniques. This perspective does not come from a few maverick leftist academics. Richard Evans, the professor of modern history at Oxford, after pointing to the singularity of the Nazi genocide, I quote, assembly line extermination and killing pits that had no precedent, then goes on to say that imperialism, and not just German imperialism, had normalized elements of the Nazi conduct. I quote again, the policies of segregation, deportation, and expropriation had their precedence in the colonies. End of quote. Other historians, for example, Mark Matzerer in Hitler's Empire, have pointed to colonial settlement, social Darwinism, eugenics, forced labor being common currency among all imperial powers. And of course, Hitler was ready to coexist with the British Empire, but to create a similar colonial system on the continent. The second approach, and expand eastwards to enslave the Slavs and evict the Jews. And eventually in 1941, that plan to evict the Jews led to the extermination. The second approach that forms part of the transnational turn is through genocide studies. And this too, like Nazism, this too links Nazism to wider international context. In this perspective, Nazi genocide is an extreme case of ethnic cleansing and mass murder that had been preceded and was later followed by a number of other genocides. In these cases, the main driving force was either settler colonialism, as in Australia, the US or Canada, or more commonly, ethnic nationalism. Of course, the two can be combined. From the 1860s onwards, in the Ottoman, Habsburg, and Russian empires, numerous nationalist movements sprang up and sought to found ethnically homogeneous states. And these frequently led to the expulsion and sometimes genocide of ethnic minorities. And of course, the German Imperial League, one of the ideological sources of Nazism, was one such movement. And of course, we are not apparently at the end of this process of ethnic nationalist movements. Both of the so-called transnational approaches I mentioned highlight that there were some singular features to Nazism, and without doubt, Jews were its principal victims. But many aspects of its continued and in many cases radicalized elements it shared with other forms of imperialism. A fairly accurate gauge of the parameters of the official perspective on how the Holocaust and the Nazi period as a whole should be interpreted for the public is the material provided by the Center for Holocaust Education at UCL. Now, this center, established in 2008, provides training and teaching packs on the Holocaust for teachers in secondary schools. It is therefore a very influential body, and it's, I have to be short now, but its perspective is laid out in a 272-page report entitled, "What Do Students Know and Understand About the Holocaust?" Now, what's interesting about this is that published in 2014, its authors are extremely careful to give extensive references to the historical literature, to the scholarly literature, to indicate what they think students should know. But they mention neither ethnic nationalism nor imperialism. The same applies to the information put out by the Holocaust Memorial Trust for the annual Holocaust Memorial Days. The internalist perspective, German history in a silo, prevails in the public domain because it validates the politics of the British political elite and of Zionist organizations. It would serve neither's political agenda to see Holocaust education generate debate about imperialism's connection to racism. And Zionist groups will object still more to the historical record of ethnic nationalism being scrutinized. its idea fixed to forge a nation on the basis of a common ancestry and culture, to legitimize a distinction between those who can belong to the nation and those who cannot, has driven every nationalist movement's ethnic cleansing in Europe, at least since the 1860s. But there is silence on that connection that the Nazism had with ethnic nationalism. Holocaust education has been shaped, of course, not only by what the British state and Zionists want to avoid, but also what they want to say. For the Zionists, it's a way to promote the view that anti-Semitism is the most dangerous form of racism for all times, requiring for Israel exceptional support and special dispensation. So this is where the exceptionalism has been fortified. For the British state and its intermediaries, depicting anti-Semitism as a major threat serves somewhat different political objectives, and I will conclude on this. Firstly, it recalls a redeeming episode from Britain's imperial past, an episode in which Britain confronted Nazism, the barbarism of which makes Britain's own imperial record of racism and violence appear less reprehensible. Secondly, it helps to justify the current strategic alignment with the US and Israel in the Middle East as a humanitarian intervention in the tradition of fighting fascist rule in Europe, notwithstanding, of course, the disastrous outcomes that has brought about. And thirdly, it serves a myth that left-wing and Muslim opposition to Israel has to do with hatred of Jews and not with Israel's oppression of the Palestinians and its active participation in the imperial security apparatus. So I began by saying that the allegations against the left of anti-Semitism proved such an effective weapon for the labor right, the pro-Israeli lobby, and sections of the media because it had a wider resonance. The ideological ground for elevating anti-Semitism into the most threatening form of racism has been prepared over several decades. Since the late 1990s, it had been deployed for the defense of Western values. But in fact, it functions to facilitate the workings of an imperial order which now requires forms of racism other than anti-Semitism, principally Islamophobia. Let's be clear, the most dangerous form of racism at any particular time is that which the state propagates, or at least colludes in. The state and non-state agencies which have promoted Holocaust into a central cultural and moral reference point portray it as a culmination of a self-contained history that unfolded through a long line of hostile, sometimes murderous acts against Jews. The dogma of eternal Gentile hatred, as Norman Finkelstein has argued, serves, I quote, both to justify the necessity of a Jewish state and to account for the hostility directed at Israel. The anti-Semitism charge against the left is aimed at delegitimizing its anti-racism by trumping it with what purports to be anti-racism, but functions to defend the existing power relations here as in Palestine. I'm sorry, I went on a bit too long.
Well, thank you very much, Paul. That's fine. You covered really quite a wide area, and you know, very fascinating, very stimulating talk. So that's good. Don't worry about the time for that. I'm hoping now that the host will be converting people into panelists so that they can then use the chat box and use the blue hand so that they can indicate if they wish to come in. At the moment, I've got one speaker indicated, which is Peter Manson. If I can just find him. Just scroll down. Come in now, Peter.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I too very much appreciated that, Paul. Thank you. Yeah, just a few points about what you started and ended with, and that is the use of this anti-Zionism equals anti-Semitism campaign to target the Corbyn leadership in the Labour Party. I think that's true, but it's a subsidiary element. I agree with you. It's the main element of the campaign is to combat the decline of pro-Israelism, I suppose you can put it that way, within the West. I mean, Moshe Makova points out to the fact that it's particularly acute in the United States amongst US Jews, for example, whose illusions in Israel have rapidly been been dissipating to some extent. And the reason why it's essential for imperialism to maintain support for Israel is because of Israel's role in the Middle East. It's a key ally of US imperialism in particular. I mean, what if the West wants to attack Iran, for example, it might well be Israel that is the launches the air raids or whatever. So it's important, therefore, to try and downplay the accusations of Israeli oppression against the Palestinians. Say the main thing about Israel is it's a beacon of democracy and progress in the Middle East, and it's a progressive state. That's why we side with it. And of course, there's a link to the campaign to smear the left, particularly in the Labour Party. Corbyn himself had a long record of opposing Israeli oppression and supporting Palestinian rights. How reliable would he be as in this overall context of Israelism, if you want to call it that? But I agree, it's still a subsidiary element to it all. Okay. I also agree with you. I was saying how in the past Israel. I mean, you pointed out it was Israel was regarded much more widely as progressive, including on the left, wasn't it? You know, we on the left thought, or especially the Labour left, pointed to the progressive nature of Israel. I mean, here they were. They set up these cooperatives, didn't they, called kibbutzim? That's a good thing, isn't it? So it was regarded until the last few decades. It was regarded as a much more progressive institution, and of course, it's been going downhill as oppression of the Palestinians intensified, in fact. I just want to say a couple of words about Zionism itself. I mean, it came to the fore in the late 19th century as a reaction against widespread anti-Semitism in lots of different states. However, but it didn't enjoy great support. Only a minority of Jewish people, took it up. It was because, and you can see why, because basically Zionism itself is a reactionary ideology because it's for separatism. I mean, the anti-Semitism was real enough, but our reaction to that should be to unitedly combat it. That should have been the action of the working class leadership. We don't say, well, Jews are always going to be oppressed, therefore the only solution is for them to get out and go and form their own state somewhere. And for a long time, Zionism, for that reason, was a minority argument. But then, obviously, it was adopted by imperialism too. Just turning to the general question of anti-racism, which you obviously link to the whole thing. I mean, I think what you can say is racism was part of colonialism and building an empire, wasn't it? How do you justify the British going around the world. Well, we went around the world bringing civilization, didn't we? I mean, that's what we were taught at school. And no wonder it's obviously got a racist element to it, in that, you know, it means that, so it implies that the people we brought civilization and we even taught them democracy in some cases. They're obviously inferior peoples, and it needed us to help them along the way. So racism and this empire building went hand in hand. But once the British Empire ended, they replaced it with something called the Commonwealth, didn't they? You know, we're all united. We're now working for the Commonwealth. And there was a switch at that time away from the widespread racism that permeated the media up until the 50s or so, or the 60s, I would say. During that time, there was a switch into, I think, the opposite, where it's not what we need. The empire, the days of the empire is long gone. So what we need to promote British nationalism in a different way. And that is to say, well, we in Britain, we're all equal. We all have an equal interest, don't we? And that is the interest of the British nation. So it doesn't matter whether you're a worker or a capitalist, or black or white, you're part of the British nation. And therefore, we're against racism. The enemy, if you want to call it that, is outsiders who opposing a different form of nationalism. It's Britain first and foremost that we've got to promote. So therefore, their anti-racism is a kind of reactionary form, which is very much linked to a reactionary form of nationalism. Just one other thing on the question of Nazis. It was the Nazis' anti-Semitism. I've pointed out that when it comes to empire building and colonialism in generally, then that had a race, that was naturally racist because of the nature of what was going on. But I think the Nazis' form of racism, their anti-Semitism, isn't necessarily linked with their imperialism, is it? I mean, it was conducted against people within Germany, initially and first and foremost. So they were reactionary, they were racists, okay. It wasn't just the Jews they looked down upon. But Jews targeted.
Could you stop?
That's my final point, so I'll stop now. Thank you.
Okay, next speaker, Moshe Makova.
Oh, thank you. First of all, thank you, Paul, for a brilliant presentation. I think you made it very clear that the recent and present witch hunt and campaign that instrumentalizes the fight against anti-Semitism to defend, to ring fence Israel, has a prior ground on which it became fertile. It uses pre-existing conceptions. To continue that, I think that what I sense, and I think other people have sensed, that this, let's say, sympathy with Israel and the predisposition to defend it in the general public, and importantly among Jewish people, especially in the United States, is declining. In my view, will make the onslaught of the other side even more desperate, because they now sense that they have something viciously defend against erosion of the climate that was beneficial to the Zionist propaganda. Recently, I think Benjamin Netanyahu has made things clearer to people. A significant manifestation of this is Peter Beinart's recent article, Yavne, which has come as a bombshell in the liberal Zionist circles. I think this is much more evident in the United States, but it's beginning to happen here as well. Okay, I just want to to contribute to this cultural, in quotes, aspect of this presentation that we had, a footnote about terminology, which is quite interesting, and I want to focus on the use of the term Holocaust. And its history is quite interesting. The way it has been specialized to one particular case. Well, not many people realize that the term Holocaust for the Judeocide during the Second World War is actually borrowed. It is not. It was not invented for this particular occurrence. It has prior history. The first use that I've been able to detect was by a Black activist after the United States Civil War, referring to the state, the epidemic of lynchings, which she described as a Holocaust. But the most I don't think that the term Holocaust for the Judeocide was borrowed from them. I don't think they were aware of this usage. What they were certainly aware of is Churchill's use of the word Holocaust to describe the Armenian genocide by Turkey during the First World War. He used it in the 20s. And this is quite known, and Armenian people that I know are very annoyed at the fact that it is not mentioned that their genocide was not only an example of the Holocaust, but it was actually the first to be publicly, or at least in the public knowledge, and by a very famous politician, so described. Okay, well, what was happening during the immediate period after the Second World War, where the term Holocaust was used for the Judeocide, was that it was becoming a general noun. You can find uses of the word Holocaust not only for genocides, but for catastrophes of various kinds. Holocaust began to be used as a general noun and that was very annoying for Zionist propaganda. And then came Claude Lanzmann with his brilliant 9-hour film Shoah. There is a brilliant expose of the propagandist design of this film. It was actually commissioned by Israeli propaganda. It is a brilliant film, but it's very one-sided, and it minimizes, for example, the cases in which Gentiles risk their lives to help defend, protect, and save Jewish lives. But I mean, I refer you to a brilliant article in the London Review of Books of 5th April 2012. The author is Adam Schatz. It is a general article exposing Claude Lanzmann and the propagandist purpose of this film. The propagandist purpose of this film is exemplified and made clear by its very title, Shoah. What is this word Shoah? The word Shoah is a Hebrew word meaning catastrophe. It has been used in Israel in Hebrew language as the term for the Judeocide, but in no other language. And notably, it is a Hebrew word, and it would have been complete mystery and not understood by the vast majority of the victims of the Judeocide, whose language was not Hebrew. I mean, very few, I mean, when we speak about the Palestinian Nakba, we are using a word that would be common currency among the people who were victims. When the term Shoah, the word Shoah was used for a film about the Judeocide, it was using a word that would have been complete mystery to 99.9% of its victims. Why did he use this word? Because it is a Hebrew word, and it is a word that is understood commonly in one country and one country only, and that is Israel. And that actually illustrates the propagandist purpose of this film. I'm not trying to say it is a bad film. It's a very brilliant film, but its propagandist purpose is clear. What has happened since is that the danger of the word Holocaust being generalized as a general noun has receded. Nowadays, it is even considered to be impolite to point out that there were other Holocausts. That, for example, to revert to the Armenian case, to discuss, yes, I mean, the Judeocide was one Holocaust, but Holocaust also happened to the Armenian people in 1915. That is considered to be risque. You could be suspended from the Labour Party for pointing out such things. So once again, Shoah, the word Shoah, which was very popular following 1985, when the film Shoah was first shown, and became quite generally used, has now, I find very few usages of this. People have reverted to the Holocaust, but in one meaning only, restricted to its, case of the Judaism. That's all I wanted to say.
Thank you, Moshe. The next contributor is Mike McNair.
Thank you, Paul, for extremely illuminating and helpful presentation. I guess some issues which I have one sort of starting point in a sense, which is, how shall I put this? While it's true that there is, well, your presentation very clearly demonstrates there's deeper roots than just the Corbyn leadership stuff. And I agree entirely with that. I would say, however, that we can't say that people don't just believe what the state tells them, because it seems to me it's very clear in wartime, and indeed actually in relation to Cold War stuff, there's a piece recently come out of the British intelligence services about the difficulty of combating Russian disinformation, which talks about how successfully the I can't remember what the institution was called. There was an institution which put about stories about the Soviet Union in the Cold War period, which was wound up And quite a lot of those stories were just fakery and stuff which was generally, there is a strong tendency for people the press to simply follow, the media to simply follow what the state tells them to say. There are actually not, I don't know if the D-Notice Committee is still in existence as such under that name, but there are nonetheless instruments of liaison between the security service and the Foreign Office and the press. And I think that to a certain degree, we can assume that stuff will be believed until state interests, either the state is overthrown or until state interests change, and the consequence of state interests changes, it is no longer necessary to keep the secret. So FX, British support for Islamist terrorists is now widely understood to have existed in relation to both Afghanistan in the 1980s and in relation to former Yugoslavia in the 1990s. And that's not, that's no longer, it's not a debated issue. I guess it seems to me there's two stages to this, one of which is the development of, which Moshe was talking about particularly, the development of Israel exceptionalism in the United States, which responds to the humiliation of the United States by the Iranian Revolution and the embassy siege, the truck bombing in Beirut in 1983, which has become a trope of the center of US-Israeli military alliance, the common alliance of the United States and Israel against terrorism. And going along with that, Berkowitz and all these other guys, the campaign to no platform Palestine solidarity, on the basis of its anti-Semitic character, which begins in the United States in that period, in the 1980s, and I think responds to that failure of the United States' alliance policy with Iran and the necessity in consequence to have an intensified US-Israeli relationship. And then the second stage is the point which you've made, I think, you've pinned it, you've absolutely nailed it. This is the Blair administration. And what it's about is, because it's a turn, and that turn, the fact of the sharpness of that turn is reflected in the fact that the British security apparatus and in consequence the media are split over the invasion of Iraq. That the historical position of the British state core had been to hold on to, yes, to be friendly with Israel, but not within limits, and to hold on to the British state's historical relationships with Arab regimes of one sort and another. And that was reflected in influence of Arabists in the Foreign Office and in consequence in the media, in the idea that anti-Zionism was anti-Semitism was one which was combated, and you can still find actually rightist authors in the Daily Mail attacking, who are old guys, Peter Oborne, Peter Hitchens, attacking the anti-Zionism equals anti-Semitism trope on the basis of British historic interests in relation to alliances with the Arabs. And then I think probably what happens is you get step one is the fall of the Soviet Union. Going along with that, also I think probably the effects of IMF reforms both on Israel. Yes, you can no longer present Israel as social democratic, which is your point, but also on the rest of the Middle Eastern countries, that there's a shift, that the shift, but equally actually the Iraq War of the first Gulf War, not the first Gulf War, but the Gulf War of 1991, where the British had a historic relationship with the Emirates and Kuwait and so on and so forth, and had to surrender that element of capability of independence to the United States. There's a connection with the Al Yamama corruption scandal, which again we're talking about the British losing a degree of autonomy from the United States, which the United States had accepted in relation to British relationships with Arab states. And then, therefore, with Blair going in behind, very unambiguously going in behind Bush, and yes, then your narrative of the terrific shift. You've got something which has started in the United States, but then is transferred over in connection with the war on terror and all that stuff. Your final point on the universalist perspective, I add Jens-Uwe Gutter's work on the way in which the National Liberal Party in Wilhelmine, Germany, argued for genocidal settler colonialism on the basis of the United States as the example, the shining example of genocidal settler colonialism. Just that is interesting. However, on the question of racism as the justification for empire, I'm not quite sure that I mean, well, how it certainly works is racism as the justification for slavery and the separation between slavery and plantation slavery on the one hand and indentured labor on the other. This is Noel and these guys, the invention of whiteness. I say this simply because the Brits were capable of being violently imperialist and not, on the other hand, having this particular racial narrative outside of this particular context of the forced labor regime, visible in Bain's Orinoco at an early stage and in the character of the East India Company. It was a pirate organization, but it's not a pirate organization on the basis of claimed racial superiority or a civilizing mission. That's a product of the claimed racial superiority and civilizing mission starts with the forced labor regime and then becomes a basis of 19th century imperialism rather than of the imperialism at start. That's it.
Okay, thanks, Mike. The next speaker I'll call is Chris Gray. Then I'd like Paul to come back in to respond to some of the comments. Just a couple of things that have come up on the chat box. One is a comment about the objective situation facing Jews in Britain today in terms of anti-Semitism. This was in reference to the statement you made about the survey on anti-Semitism, perhaps on its nature, and also a couple of comments on the Armenians. I know the dreadful comments of Adolf Hitler in his table talk. Who now remembers the Armenians? And he was obviously drawing on a contemporary idea that that what had happened in the Turkish Empire had now been obliterated from history. And then one last point in reference to Mike's comment on Wilhelmine, Germany. I think there is a campaign, or at least a discussion underway in Germany about reparations for what happened in German Southwest Africa. I'm sure the similar is happening in Belgium, so that these imperialist histories are, in a sense, coming to the fore. Anyway, Chris Gray and then Paul Kelemen.
Thanks very much, Paul. Okay, everybody can hear me, yep? Fine, yeah. Yes, thanks very much, Paul. Very stimulating talk And as you can see, it stimulated a good discussion already. I think the important thing to draw out of this is the colonial situation. The colonial situation produces racism, it produces violence against the colonized, and the consequences flow from that. I was trying to find a book which I had on my shelves. I think I must have I must have sold it. Which would have been a bad mistake. This was by Aimé Césaire from Martinique in the Caribbean after the Second World War, when he comments on the war and the Western liberal democracies' response to it. He says, "But you're complaining about fascism. What we've been living through before all this can be described as fascism. So what are you complaining about?" Yeah, I mean, the reference to the Moshe made between the Shoah and the Hebrew word Nakba. I mean, it seems to be that I mean, my knowledge of both languages is defective, but it seems to me that the meaning is somewhat similar in both cases. And when it comes to colonial situations, I am reliably informed that Sir James Craig, Lord Craigavon, when asked about his attitude to fascism when he was ruling the 6 counties, said, "Well, actually, we have the Black Brethren and we have the Royal Ulster Constabulary, and that, as far as I'm concerned, is all the fascism we need."
Hello. Should I now respond to the points that we made?
Paul, yeah, just a moment. If you could respond now, we've got a number of other speakers coming in afterwards. So I'll give you 10, 15 minutes or so to respond. Yeah, we've had some communication problems, I think, with Chris. So off you go.
I think Peter Nelson made a point about Israel being a key ally of US imperialism. And, you know, that's clearly a significant aspect of the kind of pro-Israel sentiment. As Mike later made the point that there is a division, or historically has been a division within the British state itself about how significant Israel was for Britain's Middle East interest. And that's also in the US State Department that split is reflected. But because of the weakness of Arab nationalism and the pressure from Zionist groups, both in the US and in Europe, and Britain included, that balance, that split has now gone very much in favor of those who think that seeking to placate Arab nationalist pro-Palestinian views are insignificant, that they can be ignored. During the Wilson era, it was still argued by Tory MPs, including Jonathan Aitken, for example, that Wilson's pro-Israel stance was putting British interests with Arab states at risk. Now that kind of argument seems to be discarded. And of course, now with the United Arab Emirates normalizing relations and Saudi Arabia de facto has, of course, been in cahoots with Israel for a long time, etc. So I think that division has decisively swung in favor of the pro-Zionist lobby or the pro-Israel lobby. I'm not sure about your point about British nationalism or British interest. I think Britain is operating within an imperial system, and therefore British nationalism can't be recovered for a progressive objective. Now, on the question of how Nazi racism was connected to imperialism, it simply shared some of the basic intellectual arguments. For example, the idea of a racial hierarchy, which was widely shared in Europe by eugenicists of all sorts, including those who operated in Britain. People like Francis Galton, the son-in-law of Charles Darwin, was a eugenicist, and within that was a notion of managing the biological makeup of the population to prevent it from degenerating. And the argument was made that the proletariat were having too many kids, whereas it should be the middle classes who should be encouraged to procreate because genetic makeup mattered. So those kind of arguments easily morph or can be used for a variety of purposes. The idea of forced labor, all of these, the infinite number of links, and the very idea quite central to Nazism of the Lebensraum, of expanding territorially to acquire resources, but also to exploit the Slavs. I mean, Moshe made the point about the way that the Holocaust has been exclusively used for the Judaicide. And of course, when you look at the way that Nazi racism operated, I mean, in certain regards, it was not that different from the British idea of inferiority of certain ethnic groups. That's they drew from a common intellectual heritage of categorization by apparent aptitudes based on genetic makeup. So I come to Moshe's point. I'm very honored that Moshe should be present. He's a tremendously important figure in the anti-Zionist education of my generation and subsequent generations. I heard him first speak in Shavli University when I was a student in 1968, and it was absolutely transformative for me as a Jewish person to hear somebody speak like that. I'm very pleased to see him vigorously fighting on. It's an inspiration to us all. And of course, I take his point. I adopted actually the word Holocaust, but of course, he's as he makes a point, that itself, in a sense, slips into this exceptionalism category and severs the link with other forms of genocide. And the point he made about Claude Lanzmann is also a very important one, because although I focused on how the state has been promoting the elevation of the Judaicide as a uniquely dangerous form of racism. Of course, there's been a whole industry from the cultural elite, which has also contributed to this perspective. On the point that Mike Machair made about the split of the middle, split over the division in the British state, I've touched upon. On his point about support for genocide, well, I think one of the influential figures in the British Labour movement was J.A. Hobson, and his books, Imperialism, a Study, was very much lauded by Lenin for understandable reasons, because Hobson called imperialism a parasitic system, as opposed to Kautsky, who saw it as just another stage in the development of capitalism. So Lenin used Hobson to basically critique Kautsky, but in the process, the left has come to treat Hobson as in a rather uncritical way. And of course, Hobson was quite accepting of settler colonialism and the genocide that resulted from a number of settler colonial regimes in South Africa, in Australia, in Tasmania, in Canada, etc., because of the argument that here was a superior race that by Darwinian principle had demonstrated itself to be more vigorous and had been able to wipe out the indigenous populations. So, Hobson was a social Darwinist, and those social Darwinist ideas, again, are ones which were shared by all the imperialist powers, whether it be French, the German, or the British. And of course, the Armenian genocide is a very important case of how ethnic nationalism feeds that desire to homogenize a certain national grouping, the control over territory with and establish a homogeneous nation there is common to, and Turkish nationalism, as it began to develop, saw the Armenians as a fifth column because of their links to these historical links to particularly the French, and they were Christians, so they were an alien element who had to be liquidated. Now, it is true that Nazi hostility to the Jews was born out of a specific mutation of that idea that the Jews belonged to no nation. They were the manipulators both of the United States, of the Roosevelt regime, and of the Bolsheviks. All of them, they were instruments of the Jews. But the mechanism and the ideas which fed into that, yes, it has some peculiarities, but it also has some very general connections to the wider system of imperialism. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Paul. Got a few more speakers now. Jack Conrad, please.
Thanks, Kevin. Yeah, I just wanted to take things maybe in a slightly different direction, because Paul, you quoted, I can't remember the name of the author or the institution, but at the very beginning of your talk, this 5% figure of anti-Semitism on the left, which I can say, okay, fair enough. Given that how many people are liberals, conservatives, let alone far right, the figure goes up, I don't know to what, 10%, 20%, 50% or whatever. But the problem I've got, and obviously haven't read the study, the problem I've got though, is that definitions change, and definitions are being fought over now. And it wouldn't surprise me in a year or two's time to look at the latest Oxford Dictionary and to find out that anti-Semitism is actually to describe the state of Israel as a racist endeavor, for example. We already have in the Labour Party that existing as doctrine. The new General Secretary has told Labour Party members that you cannot have a meeting to even discuss this question. So in that sense, these ideas invade words, invade meanings, and meanings change. And I can readily accept that historically there's been a definite anti-Semitism on the left. We don't need to look very far back in terms of our history to Proudhon, to Bakunin, to the founder of the Social Democratic Federation in Britain, Henry Hyndman. There you are. There's a distinct anti-Semitism. We can look at the Labour Party, not only in terms of its response to, substantial Jewish migration from Eastern Europe, in particular from the Tsarist Empire, but we can also look at Fabian socialism, who were not only anti-Semitic, and you were talking, about racial theory and eugenics, H.G. Wells, Bernard Shaw, there it is, let alone when we get into the establishment with Churchill and all the rest of it. You described the situation in World War II and at the end of World War II of mass anti-Semitism. Well, okay. So anyway, the point I wanted to make is that it's in their, it's in their interest. There's a definite interest at the moment in changing the meaning of anti-Semitism and charging the modern left with anti-Semitism. And it does strike me, while there's a truth there, that, we've come across some weird examples. I have to say that when you come across them, the vast majority of the left sort of takes an intake of breath when you hear these people, because on the modern left now, I think anti-racism is part of our identity. And in that sense, that's why I think this campaign has had a particular brilliance to it. I know it has its origins elsewhere and in other circumstances, but to accuse comrades on the left of being anti-racist, the tendency is either they say absolutely not, or they start looking, at their deepest psychology, because we have the sort of mentality that if we use the wrong word, we're guilty of racism. And in that sense, the left can be very introspective and full of guilt. Anyway, so that was just a thought there. So in other words, the left, in the form of Corbyn, John McDonnell, Diane Abbott, they've never fought back on this question. And indeed, if you look at the leaked report that came out of the Labour Party that's under investigation at the present time, they were responsible for this category of denialism. In other words, if you deny, like you've just done, that the Labour left has a serious problem with anti-Semitism, you are guilty of anti-Semitism. Moshe is guilty of anti-Semitism. I'm guilty of anti-Semitism. Most people here are guilty of anti-Semitism. And in that sense, what happens, and I'll finish with this, is that not only did the official Labour left in the Labour Party appease Zionist opinion, it actually became an agent of the witch hunt itself. It's never challenged in an intellectual way the IRHA definition, so-called, or the 11 examples. We know that Corbyn was reluctant, but he's never done anything in terms of trying to take this apart, never done anything to intellectually challenge it. All we've had is we must still be able to criticize Israel, and we must still be able to act in solidarity with Palestine, full stop.
Okay, the next contributor is Jim Cook.
Hello, and thank you very much for the talk and for the history. In this country, for instance, very interesting. And it rang a bell or two. I went to explicitly Christian schools, not surprisingly in this country. And casual anti-Semitism was the norm. Casual racism was the norm. All sorts of words which wouldn't use now. I never knowingly met anybody Jewish until I went to university. I may have unknowingly met the milkman or the neighbour or whatever. At university, I met Jewish people and made some Jewish friends as well, I'm happy to say. Both yourself and Moshe and others have said about the declining loyalty, I suppose, of American Jews to Israel. And I would think it's, to a large extent, the result of things which they cannot really hide, like Operation Cast Lead, Operation Protective Edge, the attack on the convoy to Gaza, and the numbers of, I don't say this is defense, but the numbers of military and civilian deaths on each side are quite remarkable. You can't really claim you're protecting yourself when you kill that many civilians and bomb hospitals and the rest of it. And since then, Trump, the mutual love between Netanyahu and Trump, and now the annexation, which, put off or not, is still an annexation. And the sense of impunity, which they've got, of course, Netanyahu got because, of course, they've got the full support of the United States. And even if Trump is defeated, I'm sure they'll have the full support of Biden as well. And of course, they have the press, led in this country by the BBC and the Guardian, in terms of attacking the left. The press helps to give this sense of impunity. But if the loyalty of American Jews is beginning to drift away, then, as Moshe says, you've got the desperation on the other side. And the desperation, perhaps, to have a fait accompli as soon as possible from the river to the sea and say, well, you know, we've done it. And there'd be a bit like Millwall Football Club. Excuse any Americans here, but everybody hates us, nobody loves us, we don't care. If they can just get that finished. Now, on the press, I think that, you know, what Mike was saying about the state and the press, we've also got, it's a lesser item, I'm sure, but the massive decrease in the number of journalists working for the press in this country and the United States. You know, it's not just there's a couple of journalists drop off and aren't replaced when they retire, but hundreds at a time. And so the source of pretty well all foreign news is the State Department, the Foreign Office, and so on. There's hardly any journalists left anywhere else, except online, of course. Some of the best journalists are online, like Jonathan Cook, I think, who's excellent. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Okay, the next speaker is Yasmin Mather.
Okay, I don't have much to say. Thanks very much for a very good talk, Paul. I am concerned in some ways that now the term anti-Zionism being equal to anti-Semitism has become the norm. So if you're talking to the media, if you're looking at newspapers, if you listen to some radio programs supposedly from the intelligent channels, I think Radio 4 claims itself to be the radio of intelligent talk. But in all of these, the idea that criticizing the state of Israel is anti-Semitic has now become accepted. It's gone further. In some places, a criticism of capitalism is now definitely criticism of imperialism if you're talking of US imperialism, but definitely criticism of capitalism can also be associated with anti-Semitism, which in some ways is actually anti-Semitic because it implies that capital is only owned by a very few people of a certain religion. Someone, after the death of the assassination of General Soleimani, made a comment at a seminar I was, and I wondered what you thought of it. That comment was that basically we, as the left, as the anti-war movement, lost the battle regarding the Iraq War. For all the divisions that existed within the ruling community circles, we basically didn't manage to pursue the issues. We ourselves became confused. The media was very good at confusing us with civil wars in Iraq and later civil war in Syria. And as a result of this, we are, if you like, guilty of the current situation in the media, in that had we fought better, had we argued more strenuously against what became the Blair line in terms of the Iraq War, while everyone, including some of the journalists who now defend Israel, admitted the lies of the Blair administration, we basically didn't make much of it. And I think there is a point about that. In some ways, I would say, I'm not saying maybe we couldn't do anything else, but in some ways, the left is also guilty in having given up on issues such as anti-imperialism and anti-war. It wasn't fashionable. Some people got distracted by limited support for this or that other faction, especially after the Arab Spring. That confusion became even more obvious. Anyway, I just wondered what you thought of it.
Okay, next comment from Gabby. Gabby Rubin.
I'm here. I had a couple of very short comments. When I was teaching in New York, which wasn't that long ago, the phrase melting pot was no longer being used. It's now called a salad bowl because, well, I think the analogy is fairly self-evident. Of course, the problem is that a lot of condiments are on the side and you have to decide whether or not you're going to add them, but that's another question altogether. It did, it seemed to me, though, point to a shift in attitude towards minority groups, in the sense of not everyone being the same, but people sort of rubbing along together a bit like in the British model. Whether that's actually possible is another question altogether. The only thing that's given me any interesting pause for thought is the fact that there are so many Jewish teachers who have retired from New York to California, New York to Florida, that there is an active branch of the teachers' union in Florida made up wholly of retired Jewish New York teachers. And this group seems to be actively shying away from unequivocal support for Israel, which they used to have. I mean, not that I've had much to do with them, but I'm in touch with how they're working. And that seems to me to be a bit of a bellwether in terms of the rest of the population, certainly of teachers. And the last thing is that with respect to Britain, I was just told last night that someone that I know has been suspended from the Labour Party for supposed anti-Semitism because of a tweet that she put out talking about Islamophobia. And apparently the fact that she was talking about Islamophobia means that she is anti-Semitic. So I suggest you think about that.
Okay, thanks, Gabby. The next speaker is Jim Moody.
Thanks, Chair. Great introduction. Thank you, Kevin. I was particularly interested to see various commentators here talking about British imperialism and the core nature of it in relation to what we're discussing. Of course, who invented concentration camps? The British in the Boer War. I've got a book somewhere that was published immediately after the Boer War, where these camps with photographs are described as, you know, part and parcel of the way of dealing with the Boers. Men, women, and children into camps left to die through malnutrition and disease. So that's, you might say, where that started anyway. But obviously, the other comparisons have been well made. Going on to the way that I think Israel emerges, and Paul talks about this in his book, I know, the idea that, in fact, Israel was seen by the left as a very positive thing and needed to be supported in the early days. I can remember the forerunner of the organization Liberation, when it was called Movement for Colonial Freedom. As a teenager, I very much wanted to get their badge. It was a yellow Star of David. That was the organization's symbol. And so that was certainly part and parcel of any of us in the early post-war years, growing up into politics. The continual actual bombardment, it seems to me, from memory, of pictures of Bergen-Belsen and the mounds of bodies that were shown, and these pictures were seen as suitable for children because they were on early in evenings and so on, because it was basically a propaganda. And of course, as we can look back now and see as part of the propaganda towards eventual justifications for the existence of Israel. But the way that those who are not using it as propaganda, of course, it affected my uncle greatly. He was with the Wiltshires who liberated Bergen-Belsen. So you can imagine the effect on his personality and part of his continuing radicalization and most of our family. The fact is that one thing that points up the way that this whole aspect of defense of Israel through its various phases, as Paul has so ably pointed out, and it's not been mentioned today at all, but I see it as most indicative, as a kind of counterpoint to the way that the mass murder of Jews has been used, is of course the Parajmos, the Romani Holocaust. Ian Hancock, who is an activist in this area, he's estimated that out of the 2 million Roma in Europe before the Nazis, 1.5 million were killed. And it's, I think, generally accepted by those who are presumably not Zionist historians in this whole area, that the decimation of the Roma population is certainly comparable in proportion to that of the Jews in Europe. And of course, the Jews were many, many more in numbers. But these two populations were attacked with equal fervor. And I think the fact that, of course, there's no Romani homeland, we can't all go back to North India and claim a section of Rajasthan or anywhere else in between. These things have never been raised. But the fact is that there is, because of the Zionist movement, there was established eventually a so-called homeland for Jews. And as usual, of course, not sweeping under the carpet, if not sweeping into the sea, the whole question of the existing population that inhabited the territory of Palestine. So I think that for me is a big counterpoint and illustrates so well the cynical use of the crime against Jews that was committed and how that's been developed into this whole situation. And I find it hardly bearable that those of us on the left get castigated as anti-Semitic, when what our whole political being has been for probably all of us has been absolute fight against racism, including anti-Semitism, all our political life. I'm certainly in my day, from school days onwards, you know, you're talking about a long period where we've all been fighting against this horror of racism. But anyway, we know from the discussion what it's about, why it's been developed, and I think we have to just grit our teeth and fight on the basis that we have to. And it's organizations like Labour Against the Witch Hunt and so on, which I think are doing a grand job. We can, is one of the ways we can convince people. And certainly in my constituents, Labour Party, nobody's yet, except one person who then left the Labour Party, has dared to call me or any of the others anti-Semites. But time moves on, circumstances change. We will see in the next few months and years. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Jim. Pamela Blakelock is the next speaker.
Right, thank you, Kevin. Okay, I was brought up in a Zionist household and went to Israel with Habonim and became a communist after that, against Jewish nationalism. I found your talk very helpful, Paul, in bringing out different aspects of the background of anti-Semitism. And I just wanted to raise a couple of areas of research going on at the moment, which people should be aware of, and probably are. There is the Pears Institute for the Study of Judaism or Anti-Semitism, I'm not sure, but college. And one of the lecturers there, Brendan McGeever, was instrumental in lecturing on the Russian Revolution commemoration in 2017, where he and Simon Pirani put on a series of monthly lectures on the history of the communist movement. Jim Cook was one of those who was present. And Brendan McIver's contribution was on his PhD, or his study of anti-Semitism in the Bolshevik era, pre and around the Bolshevik taking power in 1917. And he focused on studying, first of all, the campaign against anti-Semitism by the Bolsheviks, but the contradiction that areas of peasantry were very anti-Semitic, and explaining this contradiction in terms of the role of Jews in Russia at that time as the rent collectors for the big estates, which were not owned by Jews, but the role of Jews in that money area, with which you know, most people here would be familiar on the history of Jews and the role of Jews as moneylenders and etc. And the pogroms, a few very small minority of pogroms were committed by people who labeled themselves Bolsheviks, and exploring this contradiction. And I think Brendan was, his research was very useful. But what has come out since, to my knowledge, is that he has bought into this left anti-Semitism theory, that because of this, and because these peasants were anti-Semitic, as opposed to the Bolsheviks who were fighting anti-Semitism, has brought into this left anti-Semitism theory, which also, to my understanding, dominates this Pears Institute. And it's something we should be aware of and try and fight. Tony Greenstein has done a good critique of this. Now, I haven't read Brendan's book, but I've been to his lectures about this. On the positive side, in terms of anti-racism, University College London has got the research monopoly, I think, on British reparations to slaveholders, which has given us new knowledge about the nature and extent of slavery of British owners of slave plantations, both, I think, both in the West Indies and in the southern states of the United States. What has come out of this is absolutely horrific. And David Olusoga has done some very good television programs on this history. And so this new insight, and accompanying this, the development of the Black Lives Matter movement, can give us more ammunition on the whole question of fighting racism as a whole and raising what the history of British imperialism, British colonialism. And in connection with that, I absolutely agree with, you know, I think every comrade here will understand how the neglect of British imperialist history is so important for capitalism, or what is now called neoliberalism. And the struggle to understand, for example, the First World War, the development of the imperialist nature of the First World War, which was completely ignored in the 1918 celebrations of the end of the First World War, 1914 celebrations at the beginning of the First World War. And it is so important for us, in order to understand racism in all its forms, you know, to promote this. Just as an aside, in my constituency, Labour Party, we have a left majority, which is very fragile, and we've been putting on officially Marxist classes and left-wing interpretations of history. But as we all know, this development of our friend here is making life for us extremely difficult. Anyway, thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Pam. And the last contributor again is Mike McNair.
Sorry, I just wanted to come back in the sense it's only partly. I would endorse Pam's point, and it's also implicit in Paul's stuff, that we've had a suppression of the history of study of the history of British imperialism, and in general, but the reality is this is part of a general suppression of the study of history, that it has become the case that history is dominated by everyday life in Roman Britain, everyday life in Anglo-Saxon England for the primary school kids. And then we go into GCSE, and it's the age of the dictators, 1914 to 1945. This, of course, is the product of the national curriculum, that in essence, the government appointed a bunch of Tory academic historians to set up the national curriculum in history in the 1980s. And the theoretical justification for it is that it's more accessible for working class kids to read about stuff which their grandparents or great-grandparents might have been involved in, and the sources are much easier to read, and so on and so forth. But in reality, it's just a mechanism for teaching conservatism, teaching standard media narratives and depriving people of any possibility of interrogating standard media narratives. But then that brings me back, I think, to what I really wanted to kick in was Yasmin's point about that some of this is the product of the left's failure in relation to the anti-war campaign over the Iraq war. And it it's an important point. It's a really important point, because it's not that we got defeated. That we got defeated is sort of given. There's no way of stopping a state from going to war apart from actually overthrowing it. But that it's that we got defeated, and then we didn't preserve any political consequences of this very large movement. And we didn't preserve any political consequences of this very large movement, in essence, because we were committed to thinking about it as a single issue campaign and to not turning it into politics. And indeed, Respect, which came closest to saying we are the political expression of the an attempt to make the political expression of the anti-war movement, didn't. It turned itself into we are old Labour, represent itself as we're old Labour. And what goes along, how this is connected back on, what Paul is talking about is narratives projected by a monopolistic oligopolistic media structure, and the input of states into this oligopolistic media structure with no significant counter voices. And then the question is, how do we create counter voices? We're presented with in a sense, actually, with the experience of the labour movement in the 19th century, which had to put resource into creating labour movement newspapers. Poor Men's Guardians is one of the books about it, and into acquiring land for labour movement meeting rooms, because the extent to which the Tory party and the state were using control of land to suppress dissident voices, which is something which is going on in this anti-Semitism campaign. So the mistake, in a sense, in 2003-04 was we'd had this enormous movement as a single issue campaign, reflecting the fact there was a big split in the ruling class and the state over the orientation, but we didn't cash that in terms of creating, the people who were running it thought of it as being the result of their successful media management. And we didn't cash it in the forms of creating actual long-term organisation, which attempted to run its own media and its own alternative anti-imperialist political project. That's it.
Okay, thanks, Mike, and thank you everyone for contributing. There have been some interesting points in the chat box, particularly Moshe has referred to a recording of Lenin speaking on anti-Semitism, and also a few articles have been cited, so please have a look at them. But I'll now ask Paul to sum up and draw the discussion to a close. So your turn now, Paul.
Well, thank you very much. Really very useful and valuable contributions. On Jack's point about the 5% anti-Semitism allegedly on the left, my argument was that even the empirical evidence, which normally the media is very fond of using polls, opinion polls and surveys, with all their limitations, they're quoted almost daily in the press, and yet the most comprehensive study, yes, given its limitations, nonetheless, it's there. It's a survey of over 3,000 people. It's the most sophisticated ones of the surveys, and it shows a very small level of anti-Semitism and not showing a substantial increase from 10 years previous or 20 years previous. Of course, opinions are fluid, and much depends on what questions are asked and how they are asked. There are some anti-Semitic prejudices, and no doubt sometimes they're found on the left as well, but it is not a significant level, that's for sure. And like you said, it's particularly damaging, this anti-Semitism charge, because anti-racism has become so central to the identity of the radical left, and justifiably so, because of the coalition or the alliance with anti-colonial support for, solidarity with anti-colonial forces since the 50s, and then with immigrant communities, anti-racist struggles. And in a way, what New Labour was doing was trying to grab back anti-racism. That's what my argument is. The Liberals were irritated by it. They were obviously the butt of criticism of many of the left's anti-racist campaigns for their simple, fluffy celebration of identity without taking a stance on concrete manifestations of racism. So it was an attempt to do two things: to redefine what is anti-racism, and at the same time deprive the left of this central political platform. Now, on the question of Moshe had already made this point about Peter Bernard and developments in the United States. I mean, I think that's quite interesting that in America, among Jews, there's a much more vigorous debate and a much more decisive shift to a critical stance towards Israel because of the Trump and Zionist embrace of Israel, which is clearly uncomfortable for American liberals, because it's quite clearly and explicitly a white supremacist ideology that Trump heads and articulates. So this has caused a lot of young Jews to question, what is Israel about? Why is ethnic nationalism wrong in the United States, but right in Israel? So yes, that's and a point that Gabby made about attitudes among retired Jewish teachers. I think that does reflect this kind of unease. It hasn't reflected itself to the same degree in Britain, and that's partly because of this aggressive assault on Corbyn over anti-Semitism. I think it's blocked off those kind of developments. Now, Yasmin made the point about how far was the left's failure to push home the lessons of the Iraq War. Well, obviously there was a failure there, although I think it's part of a larger failure of the shift towards a human rights discourse from an anti-imperialist one, which really dates from the late 1970s. I mean, we are guilty of this in the Palestine Solidarity Campaign. It's a very difficult issue because, you know, a lot of the NGOs provide vivid illustrations and evidence of the daily violations of Palestinians, and they articulate it in terms of human rights. Now, but there are problems with that discourse, because once you adopt the language of rights, everybody's got rights. So then we get into, like Blair does, you know, Israelis have got a right to live in peace. Well, have they got a right to live in peace when they're oppressing somebody else? You know, unless you situate the issue of rights within the system of imperialism and domination, then you create artificially a level playing field where everybody has equal rights. Everybody, you have the right to oppress and the right to resist oppression, but there's no way to distinguish between them unless you situate it within the wider political framework. And so, yes, I think there's been a failure going back a long way by the British and more generally the European left of not seeing imperialism as being at the very core of our own struggle, our own anti-capitalist, anti-racist struggle. And one of the great developments of the past 50 years has been the fact that with immigrant communities much larger in this country, that issue has to be addressed. We can't be silent on the issue of imperialism and racism and unify our own forces in this country. Those two are intimately linked. And of course, the New Labour sensed that. I mean, it was quite a deft maneuver by New Labour to shift the debate onto the defense of Western values against militant Islam. You know, you couldn't evoke communism anymore as menace. There had to be something else to reinvigorate a nationalist discourse. And as I tried to indicate, it's within that context that the Holocaust was promoted. But yes, I'm sure you're right, Yasmin, there have been many failures, not just one whole Iraqi war, but certainly that was one of them. I just want to finally to come back to this issue about which Jim Moody raised, a very important point about the Romani. And to that, we should also add the 2 million Slavs who were murdered by the Nazis, the 3.3 million Soviet POWs who were murdered, the mentally disabled who were murdered, and so it goes. One of the unfortunate consequences, but deliberate, of making Auschwitz into the emblem of Nazism is that it again singularizes it. It cuts the many connections which it had with other forms of imperialism. Actually, the Nazis killed more Jews through shootings and starvation to death than through the gas chamber. And the murder of the other groups was similarly a reflection of its ideology, that there were certain groups of people who were not fit to survive. And yes, the most extreme manifestation of that was directed at the Jews, but without showing those connections, there is this danger of exonerating other forms of imperialism. And even if there's not total silence of them, we only get sanitized versions of it. And of course, in all the points about that Kamala made about what we can learn about the slavery, but I would argue also post-slavery is very important, and how school curriculum, as Mike made the point, the school curriculum is so narrowly focused as to prevent that. So yes, all of these points amount to the fact that anti-imperialism has to be one of our tasks, to make it a more prominent source of knowledge in all our work. And I think there are some positive signs of that with the Black Lives Matter. And that is something to build on. And of course, all the other activities which the left has been engaged in community anti-racist politics, in relation to asylum seekers, in relation to workers who are not unionized, all of the struggles are part of that campaign to bring imperialism to the core of our politics. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Paul. A very interesting talk. I enjoyed that. I'm sure other comrades did as well. And I'd like to thank all the questions and comments. I would just advise there was quite a little flow of chat going on with suggestions for readings. And as I mentioned, Lenin's recording on anti-Semitism. And so just have a little scroll on that. I think that probably can be preserved in some way. And certainly the talk has been recorded. So again, you'll be able to revisit Paul's very good introduction and stimulating questions. Just before we finish for this morning, a reminder that this afternoon session, which begins at 4:30, will be Ilan Pepe talking about the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. And again, I'm sure that will be another excellent session, and I'm sure that we'll all learn a lot. So thank you very much for taking part. Thank you very much again to Paul, and I hope to see you all again this afternoon. So goodbye, and have a little break now. Okay, bye.